Hi, this is Mr. Carr, and today we're going to talk about plot and conflict in literature. So, when we start talking about literature, we need to look at the plot line. A plot line is described as the road on which a story travels, so to speak. It's a way of tracking the movement of a story, and it typically follows very specific patterns, and there was a man named Freytag that outlined these things. So when we look at Freytags Pyramid, and this was what he outlined with an exposition, a rising action, a climax, a denouement, and a conclusion, we can follow the plot from the beginning to the end of the story. Typically all stories, short stories, long stories, novels, all of them, even often poetry, follow these typical patterns. So if we look at the beginning of a story, we call it the exposition. This is the beginning. It's the who, what, when, where, and why of a story. The characters are introduced, and importantly, we get a glimpse at what is going to become the main conflict of a problem to be solved. If we're talking about a pot of water as a metaphor for the story, this is where we get the water, we get the pot, we put it on the stove, we pour it in, and we start turning it on. Things start going. After the pot of water has begun, so to speak, we move into what's called the rising action of the story. This is traditionally the main bulk of the story itself. It's where the characters develop, the plot develops, things begin to intensify, the problem that the main character is beginning to solve. We get clues along the way as how they're going to solve it. They have to overcome obstacles. This kind of thing is happening. So if we're talking about our metaphor of a pot of water, the water is beginning to simmer. Something's happening. There's movement going along. This is also where the character development happens, and we begin to really care about the characters. We begin to want them to succeed. We want the villain to fail. All of these things really deepen. As the pot of water begins to increase in temperature, eventually it's going to boil over. This is the climax. Importantly, this is not always the most intense or the most exciting part of a story, but moreover, it's where the character comes face to face with the conflict at hand, and they either are successful or they are unsuccessful. This is that turning point where the problem is solved one way or another. Once we reach the climax of a story and the problem has been resolved, whether for good or evil, the denouement is the unraveling of the story. It's the untying. It's where all of that pressure from the rising action is released slowly. It's a way that an author can respectfully retire the characters toward the end of the story. All the loose ends are cleaned up. All of those questions that we had throughout the story are answered. And if we're talking about the pot of water metaphor, this is where somebody's coming and cleaning up the stove. They're bringing it to rest. So finally, we come to a conclusion. The story comes to a reasonable ending. In modern literature, if we're talking about a series, a trilogy or so, often this is where they will introduce the next adventure. And this is when we take that pot of water off the stove, we've cleaned up the kitchen, we've turned off the lights, and we've finished everything having to do with it. We are now done. So that's how we track the 5 main elements of a story. Now, as you deepen in your ability to critically analyze literature, you'll find that there are many more facets to it than that. But this is a nice, easy working model that we talk about. So let's take a look at this. This is a commercial with Kevin Hart, and see if you can find the different pieces of Freytag's Pyramid here.
Oh, you look good.
Thank you.
Hey! See the guy taking my little girl out, huh?
Yep.
Huh. You know, why don't you go ahead and take my new car?
Thanks, Pops.
Go ahead, baby. ready to go. Are you ready? Hey, are you ready for this?
You messing with the wrong daddy!
Out of the doorway, the bullet.
I'm taking you home.
Why?
Car Finder on the Hyundai Genesis.
Back so soon?
Bites the dust. Here you go, sir.
Because a dad's got to do what a dad's got to do.
Honey, what you guys do tonight?
Okay, so if we take a look at that commercial by Hyundai, we can break it apart like this. In the Exposition, there's a father. He's greeted by the boyfriend and the daughter going out on their first date. And this is where who, what, when, where, and why is happening. And I think the Exposition ends the moment that Kevin Hart hands the boyfriend the keys to the car. You can see that we've got out the pot of water, we've started boiling it, and it is now in motion as soon as he gives him the keys to the car. That moves us into the rising action, where we move through the sequences of the movie theater and the fair and all of those things where Kevin Hart is lurking behind them, stalking them, if you will. And up until the moment where we reach the climax at the makeout spot overlooking Hollywood, Kevin Hart is dangling from a helicopter shouting, "You're messing with the wrong daddy." After that has reached its climax, its pinnacle moment, in the denouement, the boy now realizes the jig is up. He's not going to be successful in his date with the daughter. And he drives the daughter home, meets the father at the door, and then the resolution, the conclusion to the story, the father has won, and then I like the beep at the end of like, beep, just driving home, who's in charge here. So now that we've explored kind of how a plot works, the road on which a story travels, the conflict is the engine that drives it. So the conflict is that tension or the problem that the protagonist has to solve. There are often many, many conflicts in a story, depending on its complexity. A novel will have lots of them, but we can strip them down into a few archetypical ways of looking at them. We have man versus man versus nature or animal, man versus God or the fates, supernatural self, society, technology. Depending on which format you're using, there's differences to these, but these are kind of the well-rounded way of looking at it. Some examples you could have in Man vs. Man. There's Liam Neeson was in a movie called Taken. This is that story of like, you kidnapped my daughter, I'm going to hunt you down. It's the man versus the kidnapper. In Man vs. Society, we have Katniss Everdeen versus the Capitol in the Hunger Games. Man versus Supernatural, this would be like against a ghost or a witch or a warlock or something like that. Man versus God of the Fates, that could be any of these Greek tragedies. We've got Hercules, all of these things. Man versus technology, we've got The Matrix. So you see that all of the stories, you can find these main conflicts in it. And usually, although there are many, many conflicts to a well-crafted story, they will always boil down to at least one primary internal conflict, which is the struggle within the character's own mind, and then an external conflict where the character is struggling to reach a goal, and there is a barrier of an outside force. So how do you figure out where this conflict is, where these conflicts are? So it used to be in Saturday morning cartoons that a narrator would break in right before a commercial break and try to hook children to last through the commercial break and come back to hear the rest of the story. And so in the case of Superman, the narrator might have said something like, "Will Superman save Lois Lane from the evil clutches of Lex Luthor? Stay tuned for the exciting conclusion of Superman," right? So we look at this and we realize the conflict is, will Superman save Lois Lane from the evil clutches of Lex Luthor? This would be a man versus man. Superman versus Lex Luthor. Will he be able to save Lois Lane? So how about in Disney's Frozen? Internally, we have Elsa, and we could say that Elsa versus herself is, will Elsa overcome her self-loathing and doubt and accept her natural talents? Man versus man is an external one, and we could break it down to, will Arundel defeat the influences of Weselton? So now, how do these things work together? This is where we really begin to critically analyze literature. We've talked about the road, the exposition, rising action, climax, denouement, and conclusion. And then we've talked about the engine driving all of it, the conflict. Well, what happens is you have to make certain that whichever conflict you are tracking is reflected in the climax itself. And as you move into more and more complex literature, this will shift. So we just make certain that whichever climax you've delineated is in line with the conflict. And then later we'll begin to talk about theme. These things all have to line up. So the climax of a story lines up directly with its conflict when the conflict is resolved. There are multiple conflicts, so depending on which one you choose as the primary measure of your analysis, it has to be reflected in the climax of the story. In my class, I gave an assignment to now complete the elements of Freytags Pyramid on their story charts and to plot the major internal and external conflicts and to critically analyze, do they align together? Is the conflict that you are tracking aligned with the climax of the story? All right, thank you. Have a nice time learning your stuff.